Hello everyone, I'm so imaginative, and have you heard the news? BioWare has no plans for Dragonage the Veilguard DLC as it turns its full attention to Mass Effect 5. Holy mother of Casper the Friendly Ghost, it's actually happening. I'd imagine there's a lot of people that are quite excited for a potential new Mass Effect game. I'd wager it's a lot of why you've clicked on this video at all. But I wonder how many people actually understand how important this game is, both for the franchise and for BioWare as a developer. For the past 10 years, give or take, BioWare has been steadily getting closer to the edge of a cliff, threatening to jump off at any moment. This is the first piece of good news there's been in quite a while, honestly. But even with this good news, I think Mass Effect still stands on a bit of a knife's edge. So today I want to take a look at the state of BioWare and what it means for the future of Mass Effect. Now, they might not be the household name that Riot has become, but they still mean a lot to a lot of people, especially in the RPG space, the Western RPG space specifically. And they've been around for a long time in video game years, which are sort of like dog years, but even shorter. They got their start in 1996 with a game called Shattered Steel, which was a big old mech warrior type of thing, but the BioWare as we know them doesn't start until 1998 with the release of the original Baldur's Gate, unlocking their absolutely deranged fetish for the RPG. After this point, almost every game they made was some sort of RPG, with only a handful of exceptions through their almost 30-year tenure, and their releases include some very notable ones, such as Baldur's Gate 2, Shadows of Amn in 2000, Neverwinter Nights in 2002, Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic, otherwise known as KOTOR, in 2003, which was their first sci-fi RPG, and then the first Mass Effect in 2007. I only skipped 2 games throughout that entire time period, by the way, and they were sort of just pumping out bangers at this point, and after a brief romance with Sonic the Hedgehog and a Mass Effect mobile game, they kept going. Dragon Age Origins in 2009, the first Dragon Age game, Mass Effect 2 in 2010, Dragon Age 2 a year later, Star Wars The Old Republic, the MMO, also in 2011, it's sort of dragging its heels now, but it does still exist, and then of course Mass Effect 3 in 2012. 16 years after their first release, and BioWare was basically as good as you could get when it came to the single-player, story-focused cinematic RPG. Solid gameplay and diverse worlds were backed up by fantastic characters, immersive dialogue, and impactful player choice. Never mind the ability to bone your teammates. Never underestimate the importance of boning your teammates. Unfortunately, all good things must come to an end, and Mass Effect 3 started a domino effect that would see BioWare on their knees in just a few short years. Which is hilarious, because the game actually isn't that bad. Mass Effect 3 got glowing reviews from critics, and even I remember it quite fondly, despite it being so long ago that I can't really remember the specifics. It was praised as a strong finale with probably the best gameplay in the series, and an unnecessarily good multiplayer mode. During the research process for this video, I came across Bricky's video on the multiplayer from 4 years ago, and I think it really sells what made it so compelling if you want to check that out. But Mass Effect 3 was also the first game that they'd released that got a very strong and very controversial reception from players. Part of it was that BioWare had stepped away from that classic RPG angle even further, and had made a game that was much more action heavy. Mass Effect 3 is much more of a cover shooter with RPG elements than anything else, a trend you can actually continue to see in their future releases. But the big culprit is the ending. Brother, the ending. If you don't remember this game coming out, I envy you. No one would shut up about it. It got absolutely demolished online, to the point where future DLC was released that attempted to fix the ending, and arguably just made things worse. It was an absolute tragedy, and it was kind of sad to see, as, like I said, the game itself was actually pretty damn good. So despite all credit that you can give Mass Effect 3, overall it ended up as a bit of a disaster, and is seen as this stain in the shadow of BioWare's history, and I think it impacted BioWare more than anyone can really know. Mass Effect 3 was then followed up by Dragon Age Inquisition and Mass Effect Andromeda. Inquisition was taken with relative positivity, but there's definitely a sense starting to form of slipping quality, and an increasing sense of fans of the previous games not being too keen on the direction the franchise as a whole is heading. This is even more so the case with Dragon Age, because it began its life as much more of a hardcore RPG than Mass Effect has ever been. Andromeda is a real drop along BioWare's downward slope. There's less credit to give outside of it being literally just another Mass Effect, and a growing sense that the whole thing was rushed out the door. There's very little to say about Mass Effect Andromeda that you can't give the previous games. But then 2 years later, in 2019, a game would release that would cement the idea that BioWare as we knew it was basically 6 feet under. Anthem. I'd be shocked if you haven't heard of Anthem. It was very heavily modelled after Destiny. The premise was that of a safe haven where a select group of people, here known as freelancers, would go beyond the walls to complete missions for the safety of the general area. Like Destiny, it's basically a glorified looter shooter with all your motivation being aimed at higher tier gear. There is a storyline to go through and endgame grindable content as well. The most major difference was exchanging magic powers for an Iron Man simulator. Admittedly, it's quite a good Iron Man simulator, and it's about the one thing no one has issue with. These suits were called javelins and effectively acted as different classes, with abilities ranging from that of a tank to being a literal wizard, and all of them had the ability to fly. It's weighty and has a really good amount of punch behind it. The sound effects are fantastic. And systems that encourage you to use the environment to get the most out of it. Flying through Anthem's beautiful world was probably its biggest strength. Depending on who you ask, the gameplay was also quite strong, from solid gunplay and satisfying abilities to a varied loop of endgame bosses and decent challenging content. So far it doesn't sound so bad, but as I've already spilt my milk, as it were, and told you that the game was a disaster, what happened? Well, when I said it was modelled after Destiny, that also includes the part where it launched like crap. Things were pretty off from the get-go, with things feeling much more empty and lifeless than they were as they were presented in the early gameplay showings, though we shouldn't really have been that surprised. The original gameplay showcase has fake team comms in it, which is universally a sign that the game is being made up on the spot.
Nice, you've got a mortar equipped.
Yeah, I got it on the weekend.
Said trailer also showed off a type of endgame content that, if I'm not mistaken, literally never made it into the game. The gameplay may have been fun, but it didn't really advance all that much, especially past the point of the campaign, which no one has anything good to say about. All the seemingly decent content for Anthem was locked behind roughly 15 hours of BioWare's worst storytelling, which comes off so much worse when that's something you're known for. Anthem's objective types were also wildly repetitive, and launched with an incredible amount of game and network issues, multiple game-breaking bugs and connection issues that likely culled the player base before they even rolled credits on the story. It was an unmitigated disaster for BioWare in just about all senses. Truthfully, the better comparison is probably Marvel's Avengers, because Anthem never recovered despite additional attempts. There was an Anthem 2.0 update of sorts that was publicly in the works that was managing to make the game look even more like Destiny. Somehow it was literally copying UI elements, but it never went live. Anthem was abandoned roughly 2 years after its launch, a sentence I had to amend because I thought they'd flat out shut the game down ages ago. But it turns out the servers are still up, so if you really wanted to, you could play it. Funnily enough, there is actually a trend on YouTube of people doing this, revisiting Anthem now that the servers are down. And generally speaking, it's a fairly positive experience. Most of the issues with Anthem do tend to come down to the live service stuff, which is very interesting. Anthem left BioWare in a ditch with its trousers down. It completely marred the public perception of BioWare as a studio, and really helped to fuel the fire against live service games. Though at this point, that fire is like the gaping maw to hell, so it also really slowed the company down. They would release the Legendary Edition of the Mass Effect trilogy in 2021, but realistically, all that was going to do was highlight how things had changed for BioWare as a studio, and was almost certainly a move just to curry favour with the player base, because only a year later, they would announce Mass Effect 5. Their next fully fledged release would not launch until like a week ago, but we'll come back round to that. This re-release of the Mass Effect trilogy was the only buffer between their run of Dragonage Inquisition, Mass Effect Andromeda, and Anthem. People were and still are excited for the prospect of a future Mass Effect game, but that's because it's Mass Effect. At this point in time, BioWare's foundation could not be much more unstable, and that places Mass Effect itself in a very precarious position, especially at a time when a number of these former colossuses of the gaming industry are failing. They are struggling in an attempt to chase higher profit margins. Just take a look over at Ubisoft and everything that's going on with them, who they are almost definitely ending up in one of these videos at some point. And this is exactly why I want to quickly recontextualize this period of BioWare's history, because I dare say they aren't necessarily the source of the problem, which is kind of typical. Back in 2007, through very bizarre finance stuff that I'm not going to sit here and tell you I actually properly understand, because I don't, BioWare ended up as part of EA. That's right, that EA. It's in the game, EA.
EA Sports. It's in the game.
Electronic assault on my patience, EA. Initially, this doesn't seem to have had the biggest impact, though I do imagine the absolutely insane release schedule and dates and how many games they were just absolutely slaughtering out through like the mid-2000s to 2010s and stuff like that is 100% on EA. There's no doubt about it. But outside of that, it doesn't start to take too long before you start feeling the greasy smudge of EA's dirty little fingers on BioWare's stuff. The first one being the very existence of Star Wars The Old Republic. It was an MMO released in 2011. There's no way this isn't chasing the highs of the release that was World of Warcraft Wrath of the Lich King only 3 years earlier. I've only played a little bit of SWTOR myself, but if I remember correctly, there's some pretty stinky monetization stuff in there as well, which is an EA classic. Honestly, they're lucky they have some of the sickest cinematics I have ever seen. I based an entire project in college off of the one with the twins with the gold lightsabers. They were awesome. I don't know if they really do them much anymore, though at this point the game has actually been taken off of BioWare as of a couple years ago, so EA's influence would even worm its way into Mass Effect 3, namely in the multiplayer. Not just the way it's literally stapled onto the skirting boards, but in how it leverages the story to encourage you to play through the multiplayer, and of course, loot boxes. Mass Effect 3's multiplayer contained a primitive-ish version of loot boxes, which very much looks like a prototype for how EA would then insert them into the launch version of Battlefront 2, which obviously was a game that did it so greedily that it's part of why loot boxes got screwed over. All the characters, weapons, general progression stuff was in the loot box pool, and obviously it was obtained at random. My understanding is the grind wasn't actually that unreasonable, but you could still buy them with real money, so on principle the whole thing doesn't matter. This is another subject that Bricky's video goes into much more detail on if you want a better understanding of that. And the Mass Effect 3 multiplayer was just really cool, so I do suggest watching that video. Then we get to this weird streak of cancelled games that was surrounding Dragonage Inquisition like a group of hungry vultures. One was a MOBA for Fantasy Warhammer, which is obviously now known as Age of Sigmar. Another was an RTS that was converted in a free-to-play multiplayer RTS that had Command and Conqueror slapped onto the front. And then we have an asymmetrical multiplayer game called Shadow Realms, before asymmetrical multiplayer basically got owned by Dead by Daylight. All three were developed by smaller teams from BioWare, Mythic, Victory, and Austin respectively, that EA had formed throughout the years. The whole thing just screams trend chasing. All of these were in genres that BioWare had never touched before, and they aimed to capitalize on the multiplayer market, which is something that was not on BioWare's radar until The Old Republic and Mass Effect 3's multiplayer. And if you just kind of do the timelines of when these games were being developed, they slot into genres that were getting popular at the time. All these issues, this trend chasing, all of that, it obviously extends into Anthem as well. These are games that focus on multiplayer in genres that often include consistent updates and have the ability to rake in egregious amounts of money when they do work, copying all of the positives and the negatives of this type of game making. You don't actually have to watch all that much of Anthem to see that BioWare put a lot of time and passion into it. It's a gorgeous game, and it does play very well, but it is mired under the same issues that have plagued so many games in recent years, and was so clearly put out before it was ready. Ready? Asterisk, ready with an R, not a W. It seems a straightforward observation to me that BioWare's biggest problem is having to conform to the standards of Electronic Arts, which are famously very bad, and their games have suffered because of it. This leads us back round to Mass Effect 5. There has been a generally positive uptick for BioWare since it was announced, and I'm glad to see it. Hopefully they get the chance to actually deliver on it. That would be fantastic. But it is also my belief that the latest release from BioWare could and might still have a serious impact on the development of Mass Effect 5. So before we get to the end of this whole conversation, there's still one game standing in our way. Dragonage, the Veilguard. I'm sure you've clocked that the Veilguard was the latest release for the Dragonage series, and for those of you that are confused, this was originally titled Dreadwolf. It didn't disappear, it was simply rebranded, as often happens when a game is announced quite this early. Veilguard has been the centre of a considerable amount of discussion, with one side of said discussion being decently reasonable, and the other being fucking ridiculous, as is illustrated by the Wild West that is the Metacritic page. A substantial part of this is that the Veilguard doesn't share a whole lot with its predecessors. The tone is considerably lighter, the world less cohesive, combat has turned into full third-person action, and any RPG elements still surviving are what you would see in Mass Effect. It also has a much more cartoony and stylized visual style, which does permeate this, well, the whole experience, truthfully. Now, I didn't expect to see this game do very well, but for a very different reason than everyone else seems to have. I just thought this game was coming out like 10 years too late. It seems like it was made in the mid-2010s. It fits with the sort of like the late 360, early Xbox One era, more so than Xbox One. Why have I gone to the Xbox for this? Either way, it fits with that period of gaming much more than it does current day. But to my surprise, it's been taken quite positively. A lot of people get satisfaction from the combat, they appreciate the game's fantastic visuals, which absolutely is the case, and seems to really enjoy the varied cast of supporting characters. But there are also those that lament a lot of the changes, such as the fact that the tone is much lighter, the disconnection from the wider world and the lore, the massive simplification of combat. Basically, it stopped feeling like a Dragon Age game to a lot of fans of Dragon Age. And if I was a fan, I'd probably be upset about that as well. There is also a lot of just genuine issues with the game that it's kind of hard to ignore. Facial animations are hilariously poor, but this is a problem BioWare has had historically. I don't know why they keep messing this particular issue up. The writing is often surface level, which has been a widespread gripe, and the game as a whole doesn't really respect your intelligence, especially when it comes to the puzzles. The biggest example is they have a lot of locked doors, where you have to find a thing and put it in a pedestal near the door to unlock it. The problem is, you'll often have the pedestal here, and the thing will be there. Like, you can't see some point, but like right there, you'll see it. It will be in your line of sight. It will be next to you. It's right there. If you're lucky, it might be around a corner. A lot of the reactions to this game have been split down the middle. They're completely polarizing. So some people love the combat, some people find it shallow and time-consuming. Some people love the world, others find it empty. Some love the characters, and others don't. Let's put it nicely, for like 2 seconds. For the most part, the game does seem to be just fine. Only fine. And most extreme opinions, good and bad, are because the game did something specific that fell favourably or unfavourably for the person talking about it. Which is why I now need to talk about how the Metacritic score got quite that low. And let's not beat around the bush, shall we? It's a really big game for the anti-woke legion. There's a lot of diversity killed this game, sort of rhetoric floating around. Realistically, it's not that bad. And you know it's not that bad because they're using the same scene as evidence, like all of them. They can point to one scene and that's about it. And I'm just saying, if people didn't keep acting like misgendering people wasn't an issue, video game developers, which are famously leaning more towards the LGBTQ side of things, wouldn't need to put slightly awkward scenes about apologizing for misgendering in their games. So realistically, it's your own damn fault. If anyone made it to this point in the video that did have that line of belief, I doubt they're sticking around much longer. Naturally, they've taken the actual issues that the game does have, very genuine issues, and they've conflated them with buzzwords and DEI and all the usual nonsense arguments. So ignore the audience score as best you can. Find a couple of reviewers that you trust the opinion of, preferably people that both enjoy and don't enjoy the game, because the reality is probably somewhere more in the middle. And get an idea of the game yourself. Mercifully, the Steam review section is oddly free from the bombing. It's quite reasonable over there. There's definitely a pinch of it, but there's a lot of reviews you'll find that are people saying it's not as extreme either way. And it's an oddly calm place over there for the moment. My personal takeaway from the Veilguard's release is that BioWare absolutely stuffed it with Anthem and probably sunk a lot of money. So there's not much room for failure when it comes round to Dragon Age. It needs to perform well, which is why the Veilguard is so scaled back, so safely written and executed, and looks like something from 2010, and basically looks like fantasy Mass Effect with very few risks being taken, going as far to make sure that you couldn't fail a single puzzle. So what does all this mean for Mass Effect 5? Well, that's kind of the problem, isn't it? I firmly believe that the release of the Veilguard has had an impact on Mass Effect 5. I just can't figure out whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. Let's go back to the article for a demonstration. BioWare has no plans for Dragon Age the Veilguard DLC as it turns its attention to Mass Effect 5. How does that sound to you? Because to me, I'm hearing it two different ways. The Veilguard was received better than expected, which I would not be surprised about, and so they want to hit the ground running. They want to really just kick off, take the positive reaction, and just go for it. Or the Veilguard has underperformed, hence the lack of DLC, which could just never have been in the cards to begin with, and plans need to change for Mass Effect 5. Okay, I just want to insert a quick thought here. This is editor so imaginative, and I was going through and something caught me. I just want to mention that attitudes towards DLC are currently in the midst of changing quite a lot, and I do wonder if that is why we're not actually getting Dragon Age the Veilguard DLC. A bunch of games have decided to go away from it. You know, Spider-Man 2 isn't doing any. Baldur's Gate cancelled theirs. I think we are currently at a point where games are so expensive and DLC is sort of becoming less worth it, especially when it's more often that games are becoming like, it's more often that DLC is becoming smaller versions of sequels. So I do think that might have also come into it. I think we'll see how the next couple of years go around. But I just wanted to bring that up because I think that could also have impacted why Dragonage is not getting any DLC. So yeah, I don't know. Me personally, I'm inclined to believe the former. I think they're trying to capitalize on that positive outcome. But there's a voice in the back of my head that isn't so convinced. We can't really be sure without any official comment from EA or BioWare, or at least like sales numbers or something. But one thing is clear. They want us to know they are working on Mass Effect and that they are working actively. I think that will go surprisingly far. But the big question surrounding Mass Effect 5 for me is, how will it look in comparison to the Veilguard? Will it be a return to form for BioWare? Maybe even surpass their past efforts as they once again reinvigorate Western RPGs? Or is it going to play even safer than the Veilguard did? Is it going to be more reminiscent of the Veilguard, of Andromeda, as BioWare continues to try and claw back the reputation they had in the late 2000s and the early 2010s? Hell, maybe EA wants a battle pass in it. Wouldn't that be fun? Either way, that's something we can't really know until Mass Effect 5 is on the way, until we have seen more of it, until we can get our eyes at it. You know, it's something that we can't really tell. And I am hopeful. But either way, that's the video. I hope you enjoyed this catch up on the state of BioWare, and let me know your thoughts on Dragon Age the Veilguard and how it has impacted the potential release of Mass Effect 5, should you have thoughts in the comments below, unless you want to shout at me about DEI. In that case, I don't want to hear it. Sonic Shadow Generations is still happening. This was just easier to put together. I think I'm going to do these videos as like the consistent thing I keep doing, and then the big Resident Evil, Alan Wake 2, Sonic Shadow type stuff is going to be what I make when I have the damn time. So it's coming. I'm streaming at 2 p.m. UK time over at YouTube, on twitch.tv/imaginative. I try and stream most days, but life is currently hectic, so I stream when I can. And check out the second channel, So Imaginative Plays, for more gameplay oriented stuff. I'm currently putting together a DVD video on the PTB, which is kind of fun. I'll be back with another one of these when a developer decides to do something stupid that has years of lore behind it, so I can explain it because it's fun. So next week probably. I'll see you then. If you aren't watching Arcane already, do it now. Season 1 is in 6 hours in total. You can watch it in the afternoon. Do it. Catch up. Watch Season 2. It's really good. That's my PSA for the evening. Okay.